We have gone through the different speciation concepts. You guys seem to have liked the biological species concept best. So we're going to talk about speciation models that take into account the biological species concept. We'll talk about the mechanisms for speciation, specifically Allopatric, Sympatric, Parapatric, and we'll discuss adaptive radiation. And we're going to explain what a hybrid zone is and figure out what the outcomes of a hybrid zone are. We have a lot of species. You guys look around, you see all sorts of different things, and you're like, that's different, that's different. That over there, it's different. I'll take a picture. These sudden changes that lead to new species are often caused by chromosome changes. Differences in gene sequence. So sudden changes in your gene sequence can result in reproductive isolation. These species gradually arise. They do not appear overnight, except when they do. Oh, that's weird. We'll talk about times where you'll have a new species that suddenly appears overnight. Brand new, based on a combination of two parents. They typically will arise gradually in response to a change in ecological niche. After they've changed a little, they're usually still reproductively active within that population, but over time, they become reproductively isolated. This process of splitting into groups that are reproductively isolated is called cladogenesis. A clade is a group. Genesis means to create. So you're creating new groups. Here we start off with an ancestral bird, and that ancestral bird undergoes cladogenesis to become two distinct groups. This can happen in one of three ways: Allopatric, Parapatric, or Sympatric. So Allopatric speciation, Parapatric speciation, and Sympatric speciation. In Allopatric speciation, some members of the population become isolated from the rest of the population. Here we have a group of white bunnies. These bunnies live in this big open plain and life is good. They hop around. They do all sorts of bunny-like things. And then mountains rise up right in the middle of their plain, splitting this bunny population in two. On one side of the mountains, you have a lot of snow. It's in the rain shadow. There's a ton of snow. So the white bunnies have an adaptive advantage. They survive well with that white polymorphism because they're camouflaged. You can't see them. So they live, they reproduce, life's good. On the other side, it's outside the rain, so you're going to have a desert, lots of rocks. Now these white rabbits are not favored in that environment, but a mutation arises, giving this orangish or this brownish rabbit. Now that rabbit can adapt and hide, and its alleles get spread from one generation to the next. As they stay isolated, you have two distinct forms that you see: white rabbits and only white rabbits, and then on the other side, brown rabbits and only brown rabbits. Over time, the mountains wear away, a long time, and the rabbits are brought back together. Typically, at this point, if they've been separated long enough, they are reproductively isolated. One, they don't want to mate with each other. Those are prezygotic isolating mechanisms before the egg. And two, they might not be able to mate with each other. Postzygotic, there's something chemical stopping their egg and sperm from fertilizing. So that's allopatric, where you form two distinct groups, and those groups independently evolve. An example of this is the porkfish and Panama. The Panamanian porkfish. This is one of my favorite words in the English language. Do you guys know what what Panama is called geologically? It's a great word. It's an isthmus. It's the mus. Literally, that's it. So if you try saying it, if you guys try saying it, isthmus. My tongue has a hard time wrapping around that. Anyways, so Panama. Panama, during the last ice age, was above water. The ice melted, and Panama was below water. Panama is also rising up. So you had, a long time back, a split between the Pacific Ocean and the Atlantic Ocean. They were one ocean, currents could go in between. And when that happened, the porkfish very happily went from the Atlantic, what we would consider the Atlantic, to the Pacific. Over time, Panama rose, splitting that. That led to huge, huge changes in climate. We'll talk about that when we talk about geologic history of the Earth. But when Panama rose up, suddenly the porkfish couldn't get from the Atlantic to the Pacific at all. They were split, and the population was cut in half. So over time, you have an Atlantic population developing and a Pacific population developing. That's good. Then we humans came along and said, we don't want to go all the way around South America to get from the Atlantic to the Pacific. So we dug the Panama Canal. Well, now water moves from the Atlantic to the Pacific. And in that water, so goes the porkfish. Porkfish now, the Atlantic porkfish and the Pacific porkfish can interact. But because so much time has built up, so many genetic changes have been added to their genome, they cannot successfully reproduce. And they choose not to mate with each other. So that's an example of allopatric speciation. A barrier arose and split a population in two, and those two populations went about evolving independently. This might occur due to what's known as adaptive radiation. Adaptive radiation happens where a single ancestral species evolves into many, many descendants that differ a lot. We had one ancestral species, and that ancestral species branched. Humans, we saw this happen back in, far back, where we had different lines of Homo about at the same time. Think about all the different types of butterflies out there. They had one single ancestral species, and that species had to adapt to different niches. So adaptive radiation is where you have one ancestor who, over time, diverged into many, many different groups. Here we got a nice image of, I don't know, balloon animal llamas or something. But they had distinct forms. You have one that's the ancestral, and it became lots of different things based on its environment. Darwin was the first one who noted this with his finches. You had an ancestral finch species that probably looked like an intermediate, something that was on the mainland. And as it went from island to island, it had the descendants adapted to that environment. You had one group of species, one ancestral species that then went out, and over time, because they were isolated, could evolve to adapt to that niche. Something called hybrid zones throw this adaptive radiation into flux. A hybrid zone is where two populations can breed freely. You might have some large barrier. Let's say we have a population of, I don't know, redbirds over here, and you have bluebirds on the other side, and a mountain range grows up between them. Well, now the red can't get to the blue very well, except if they were to go around the mountains. And at the base where they meet, that's where they could interbreed, if they wanted to. Lizards do this. This is an image that will eventually go on to form our ring species hypothesis. But you have a zone where you have two groups of lizards coming together. They look like different species, but where they come together, there are minimal differences because they hybridize. Coyotes and wolves have distinct territory. But where those territories overlap on their edges, you're going to see species that have characteristics of both coyotes and wolves. because it's a hybrid zone. It's where the two will meet and breed. Another model of speciation is called Sympatric speciation. We have Allopatric, where you build some barrier up in the middle, and then the two species independently evolve. Sympatric speciation happens when you have two members within the same range. They start diverging into two distinct species. So here, there's no mountain that forms. We just have a bunch of white rabbits and some brown rabbits. A mutation happens. If those brown rabbits prefer to mate with brown rabbits, even if the white rabbits are present, they will go on to speciate. They're in the same place. Syn means together. So you start off, they could interbreed at the beginning, no issues. They start choosing not to, forming their own distinct groups. So you have initially hybrid fertile offspring, but over time, that goes away. Over time, you find that you're not able to have fertile offspring. This is my dead rabbit over here. The offspring are not viable. You cannot produce a living offspring between a white and a brown rabbit. This is an extreme example of within population breeding. And it takes a long time. For the longest time, in fact, in human civilization, for the longest time, people thought, well, you have this group of people here that look like this, and they're only going to breed together, and this group of people over here, and they look like that, and they're only going to breed together, and we have two distinct species. Obviously, we know that is bad science, because we can still interbreed, but there was this idea that speciation was occurring, where it's not. Speciation will occur when, that's according to the biological species concept, when there is no longer successful interbreeding. Does that make sense? One way that this can happen is through what's known as polyploidy. An organism has two or more sets of chromosomes. This is one of the speciation overnight. You give birth to an offspring and it's not the same species as you. It happens, not in humans, but in plants all the time. You might have a plant that's diploid. If through what's called non-disjunction during meiosis, the offspring ends up with twice the number of chromosomes, it can still it can still be viable. Humans, it doesn't work this way. Humans can't tolerate polyploidy. Plants love it. But that polyploid organism with extra chromosomes cannot then breed back to the original population. But that's okay for plants. Why is that okay for plants? Why is it okay that if you are a single mutated organism, you're still able to reproduce? How can that single organism reproduce? Plants can reproduce themselves. Right. Perfect plants can reproduce on their own, sexually. Plants don't need another sexual partner for the most part. Some plants do. I have a plant now, I started to grow a tree. It's a pawpaw tree. You guys ever heard of the pawpaw? That's a good question, I'll tell you. A pawpaw is it's a Virginia native fruit that you probably have never heard of in your entire lives, but early colonists, it was their favorite, it was a lot of people's favorite dessert. I think it was George Washington's favorite dessert or Thomas Jefferson's. Pretty much, it's a North American banana custard type flavor to it. The problem is you can't get them in stores because they ripen too quickly. The only way you get them is right off the tree. So, we're not going to do that. But it turns out you have to have a male pawpaw tree and a female pawpaw tree, or you have to have two perfect pawpaw trees from different lines in order to cross them. That's what I've learned. So now I have two pawpaws.
You got any fruit yet?
I have not. It's 3 years out. I will get those, and maybe some future student listening to this lecture, I'll be like, let me tell you about my pawpaws. In plants, though, a lot of flowers are perfect flowers. They can fertilize themselves. So even if you're this weird mutant, that's okay. You can always fertilize yourself. and make a whole new line. So that's polyploidy. Oh, this is allopolyploidy. An organism has at least one complete set of chromosomes from two or more different species. All right, so we get species A. They have a non-disjunction. So the A has the entire genome, big A, big A. Parent B also has a non-disjunction. The entire genome is in there, big B, big B. So when they mate, the offspring is an allopolyploid. It has two entire sets of genes from two parents. That means that it can still reproduce using meiosis. Because you can still split. It's not triploid or anything. It's still going to survive and be sexually reproductive. You've got a whole new species. So through polyploidy and allopolyploidy, you can have sympatric speciation. Speciation in one group. That is, if you look at a field of flowers, and you look at them, they all look the same except for that one guy in the middle. That might be a speciation event. And over time, that one flower in the middle will start producing more and more and more of itself until there are two distinct species in the same area. Alloploidy can lead to an absolutely abrupt reproductive isolation. And it is the major speciation factor in plants. This is how most plants undergo speciation. So that's one way of having sympatric speciation in the same environment. Another is simply geography. Now, for those of you who just threw out that whole ecological species concept, here's where it comes into play. It's the idea that you can have organisms in the same area. They can pass each other, but if they're not breeding in the same place at the same time, they're going to end up speciating. Some flies might be adapted to mangoes, while others are adapted to bananas. Thus, they only mate in one place or the other. They fly past each other, they live in the same area, they might enjoy each other's company in the way that flies do. But they will not mate with each other. And my favorite sympatric speciation is sexual selection. We talked about sexual selection because I have a favorite. Mate choice can lead to sympatric speciation. The cichlids of Lake Victoria. These are fish that are very unique. They have distinct species, and those species will only mate with each other, even though they live in the same lake. In cichlids, mate choice leads to sympatric speciation. The experiments they ran, where you had two species of cichlid, and you put them in a tank, and the females will always choose, so the P. pundamilia females will always choose the sort of lighter colored males, and the P. nairi females will always choose the brightly colored males. Every time. No issue. They successfully will choose them. It is all about female mate choice. If you were to confuse them by putting them under an orange light, suddenly the males look the same. The females can't discriminate then. And it turns out that the females will mate with any of them successfully. Sympatric speciation is happening in this lake simply because the females are choosing the males that they think are a very specific color that they like. So sexual selection leads to weird things, one of which is speciation. All right, so we have allopatric speciation, where you have a reproductive barrier arising, splitting a population in two. Sympatric speciation happens among a single cohesive population. You get an oddball or a new species forming. And then parapatric speciation happens over a very large geographic range. Let me run this one by you. New species evolve from a single geographically large and contiguous population. Let's say that over here on the east coast, we have small white rabbits. Over here on the west coast, we have very, very large brown rabbits. Would you say those are two different species?
Yeah.
Let me give you some more information. They cannot interbreed.
Yes.
There is no interbreeding, so therefore they are not the same species, right? That makes sense. Here we have, on the west coast, we got this brown one, sort of reddish brown one, about the same size. They can successfully interbreed. Are they the same species? They're producing offspring, biological species concept. Yeah, they're the same species. A equals B. Make sense? Here, this orange one can successfully interbreed with that reddish one. That makes sense. The middle one and the edge, the second one next to it can successfully interbreed. That's what we're going to get in a second. So these two then are the same species according to the biological species concept. B equals C. However, turns out the big brown one cannot mate with the lighter orange one. A does not equal C. Does that make sense? You have a very large geographic range, and as you're defining species, it turns out there's a what's called I forget what it's called. There's a cline. That's what it's called. It's a cline. A cline in variation, where you're going from one distinct group that can interbreed with others around it to another discrete group that can interbreed with ones around it, but they cannot breed with each other. That's parapatry. Almost, but not quite speciation. So here's another example. You've got a bunch of green beetles on one extreme edge, blue beetles on the other. You can say those are distinct species, but it's all the ones in the middle that muck it up. This happens a lot. The Corvus crow. Crows around here are pretty small. They're small, they're black, they yell at you. That's what crows do. Crows in California are gigantic, and when they yell at you, you fear them. Over that large geographic range, you've got lots of mid-sized crows that can interbreed with one side or the other, but the two edges cannot interbreed with each other. So it's parapatry. Same thing happens with bats. Tiny bats over here, large bats over there. Same group, but they can't interbreed, leading to speciation. So we have parapatry, sympatry, allopatry. Those are the three speciation concepts. When you have a group of organisms surrounding, in this case, a central desert, these are the typical ring species, salamanders and lizards. You'll find that there's a group that can interbreed with another group, leading to a hybrid zone in the middle. So these two, brown and pink, can interbreed. Pink and blue can interbreed with a hybrid zone in the middle. But blue and brown cannot interbreed. As you work your way around, you see that they form a ring, and that's why they're called ring species.